Good evening. Just want to make sure that audio is working. If you could send a message in the chat or let me know audibly.
It works.
Great. All right. So my name is Jonathan Davis, and I'm a ProFellow expert, and I'm going to be providing some information, tips, tricks, and really kind of clue you in on as it relates to fellowships and assistantships. Just a really quick background for myself. I did my undergraduate at Texas Christian University in Fort Worth and graduate degrees at the University of Texas at Austin, particularly at the University of Texas at Austin, where I did my master's in public policy and public affairs. I was able to acquire early on an assistantship through an urban policy institute at the university, as well as a national fellowship called the McNair Fellowship, which is an extension of what I did in undergrad. And what I think is most important in terms of being able to acquire funding for graduate school is planning and participating in activities early on. There's always chances and opportunities for fellowships and assistantships and other kinds of things to work towards establishing funding, but the biggest piece is early. Now, there's two. What I want to talk about a little bit is there's two broad different kinds of fellowships, and a really unfortunate thing is that many people use fellowship, the word fellowship, in a kind of a really broad, anachronistic kind of um, in a way that doesn't really allow people to fully understand what it means. So I just want to define a fellowship basically um, in this sense as specific funding that's allotted for graduate school and that pays for tuition and pays a stipend. Anything beyond paying tuition and a stipend for this sake is considered a scholarship. So let's say theoretically your tuition, all of your fees together are, let's say, $30,000 a year. A fellowship would pay for all of your tuition, as well as an additional stipend, whereas scholarships might pay 3,000, 5,000, 10,000, but they're not particularly suited for providing the stipend. And what I say for everyone, and it's kind of my pitch for me and for others, is that if you're going to go to graduate school, it is obviously most ideal that it is being paid, and even more ideal if you're being paid to go. Um, it's not always completely possible, but by kind of following some rules and steps, it's something that is a lot more attainable. So, one more kind of deviation in terms of fellowships. For the sake, there's two different kinds of fellowships in terms of the kinds that you can obtain. So there are institutional fellowships, and then there are external fellowships. And what I talk about mostly institutional fellowships, or at least I won't talk about external fellowships today. Um, Institutional fellowships are fellowships that are offered by the host university. So in my case, is the University of Texas at Austin. And there's a variety of fellowships that are offered either by the department or by the university, or depending on the type of university that you go to. For mine, the University of Texas system may offer fellowships as well. Um, One kind of unfortunate thing with fellowships, graduate school in general, is there's a lot of things that people don't know in applying, and this includes people that work at the very university itself. So in my case, and in many other cases at large scale universities, is that fellowship deadlines are um, sometimes they're before application deadlines, and sometimes they actually occur before the time that you would even know that you enter. And so you might ask, well, then how could you possibly apply for it? And it kind of goes back to what I was initially discussing in having to establish those relationships, establish kind of your points, and really kind of knowing everything about that institution and what they have to offer in the first place. So in my case, for the McNair Fellowship, the application deadline wasn't until sometime in March. Um, but for the fellowship, you had to be referred by faculty members in your department, and that had to occur by October. The earliest application deadline was also in October, and that's just the application deadline. So even at that point, you wouldn't know if you got in. And so really have to be um, you have to be kind of upfront with yourself in terms of how much time you have. You have to establish the bases for the means that you're. And really quick, if you all could mute yourselves. All right. And you have to establish the basis for each one of these institutions you're applying to. Okay, let's mute myself. Okay. So in this case, like I said, for myself, you had to be, you know, you had to be really forward in applying ahead of time, not just applying ahead of time at the earliest deadline. So one really key thing is applying at the earliest possible deadline. And just like for federal funding, for state funding, for all these kinds of things, institutions have all of their money at the front end of application periods. And it's not so much that it's impossible to gain funding after the first periods, but it's much less likely because there's much less money that exists. And when it comes to these institutional fellowships, what universities want to do, what they like to do, is to be able to identify early on who the people they believe are most suited for it and to award them as early as possible, because sometimes the people that they award might not necessarily go to the institution. So kind of waiting, or not waiting, people live busy lives, but waiting for later deadlines really does hurt you. Applying for that absolute earliest deadline is potentially the most key component of being able to get those institutional fellowships. The other thing is research, because with very large universities, let's say in the United States, that would be like the University of Ohio system, the University of Texas system, University of Florida, University of California. No one knows about every fellowship. No one knows about every opportunity that exists. In some cases, they might not know anything at all. And in my case, actually, in order, is it had to be referred for the fellowship, the individuals who I needed to have the referrals for the fellowship weren't even aware that the fellowship existed. And the fellowship in my case, it paid for tuition plus, I believe, $32,000 a year, somewhere between $20,000 and $32,000 a year. So you really have to get on it very, very, very early, and you have to do the research to determine where those fellowships are. All major universities in the United States are likely going to have some form of fellowships. Canada as well. The United Kingdom's a little bit different. I'll probably do something on the United Kingdom a little bit later, because their system is very, very different than it is for the United States and Canada. Now, for these fellowships, for the major fellowships, the ones that pay, the full tuition and a healthy stipend, which are paid out in monthly installments usually, they typically award very few, and they typically have a specific type of bases. So for mine in particular, I had to, the people to qualify for it had to be in the McNair program as undergrads. There were some that I saw were people from specific regions, like if you were from the Rio Grande region, people of Jewish faith. Of course, the more ordinary traditional ones are for specific types of degree programs. So institutional fellowships. The most important thing with institutional fellowships, and again, defining institutional fellowships as being those that are offered by the specific institution. And these differ from external fellowships, which for the United States would include like the National Science Foundation, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the National Institute of Health. Those are external fellowships, which I'm not really going to talk about. The institutional fellowships are the ones that are offered by the universities that you're interested in. So those, like if you're applying to like University of California system, the University of California system, and each university in the University of California system are going to have fellowships, University of Texas, University of Oklahoma, Ohio, etc. They're going to have these type of institutional fellowships. And just to kind of reiterate, institutional fellowships being those that are offered by the institution, and specifically those that pay for tuition and a stipend. there's many different people that use fellowship in all different kinds of ways, but for this specific purpose, it's those that offer that pay for tuition and a stipend for graduate school, and that's for master's level, PhD, MBAs, JDs, etc. Not so much MDs. Not that I necessarily think there's a bunch of people here for that, but those are kind of a different story. For each of these for each of these fellowships at the universities, you really have to kind of um, go out on your own and find what they are and where they are and what the parameters are for them, because they're very, very different across different universities, university systems, different states. In my particular case, for the University of Texas, for my particular fellowship, you had to be a part of the undergraduate program, the undergraduate research preparation program, but there's various ones. Like if you're in political science, or if you're in sociology, if you're in the law school, if you're doing master's public health, there's those kind of those fellowships that are based on essentially your discipline. They'll have fellowships based on region. Like I remember seeing one for people who are from the Rio Grande Valley region of Texas, which is southwest. It's like Brownsville to Odessa, something like that. There's a lot of different kinds that, for the most part, specific people aren't really going to be aware of. So even if you were to go to, say, the chair of your department or the manager of the department that you're in, they may not necessarily be aware. Your departments may as well have fellowships, but usually the biggest fellowships, the ones that offer the most money, are at the university level or the university system level. So not just your department. So say if you're planning on getting your PhD in, I don't know, anthropology or sociology, the anthropology sociology department may have fellowships. They may very well, and they may have scholarships and all different kinds of things. But the major level fellowships are offered at the university level, that you would compete with people across different disciplines. And for those fellowships, very often, and it's really strange and kind of unfortunate, you have to apply for those sometimes prior to when you actually apply to university, and other times before you even find out that you're admitted. And those are reserved for what they call the most qualified applicants. So those that the university deans would contribute the most to the university, contribute the most to the department, et cetera, et cetera. And so with that, they really kind of ask you to be extremely proactive. And so ProFellow has databases. There's all different kinds of databases, but the reality sometimes is that you really just have to find them yourself. You can kind of snowball, reach out to different professors, reach out to different departments at your university, reach out to the most important person. At each major university, probably most universities, at each university in the United States and Canada, there's a fellowship officer, who's the person that's responsible for all of the fellowships at the university. And so that's the number one person who's essentially going to have information on all the fellowships. And if you were to get a hold of them, tell them a little bit about yourself, they'll typically be pretty forefront with what you're qualified for, and they'll probably be able to provide you the necessary sites and links. And so that's kind of the broad aspect for the fellowships. Assistantships are, I'd say, a little more difficult and a little more secretive, not secretive intentionally necessarily, but one of the good and bad thing for assistantships is that they don't necessarily exist yet. And so to define an assistantship, it's a graduate level job for master's PhD level students, to where they're either teaching, so it includes teaching assistantships, research assistantships, and this other one called graduate assistantships. And these jobs at many universities, usually when I'm referring to universities, and I say major as in very large universities that have a lot of money. Smaller universities, it's not necessarily as true. But these assistantships very often will pay tuition, and will pay a job stipend. So the one that I had, or there's two different ones I had at different times. One that I had was called the Institute for Urban Policy Research Analysis, which would pay for tuition, and it paid a salary, essentially, like a negotiable salary, like a normal job. And for mine, it ranged, the actual range, it was like, I think it was 18 to $40 an hour, depending on qualifications, a bunch of different kinds of things. One of the kind of cool things with a lot of universities is that you can actually stack these. So say if you were to get a fellowship that paid tuition plus, I don't know, $30,000 a year, unless it very explicitly states that you're not allowed to have a graduate assistantship, you could also have a graduate assistantship. Of course, they won't pay the tuition twice. The tuition's already paid, but you could very well be getting that $30,000, $40,000 plus the salary from the job. And if you were to also get, say, an external fellowship like the National Institute of Health or National Science Foundation, that money you would also receive as well. Some universities are a little more picky and they'll have rules that say that you can't do those things. But some universities, like the university I went to, University of Texas, don't have those rules. And so you can stack those things. So you're collecting money from a fellowship, you're collecting money from the job, et cetera, et cetera. So the thing for those assistantships, like I was mentioning, is they don't necessarily exist. And what that means is that anyone at the university, any professor at the university or any department at the university that has enough money could potentially hire you, even if the position doesn't necessarily exist, just like any normal job. Just like if you were to apply for Microsoft and they discover that your talents fit a position that they weren't necessarily thinking about it, they obviously have enough money, they could hire you if they wanted to. And universities are the same way. The key to knowing where and how to apply for assistantships is kind of understanding where money comes from and who has money. And so it's a little bit of understanding the tenure system, which I'm not going to get too much into that, but the rule is this: if their job title is professor, like professor of education, professor of law, that means they're tenured and it means they have money. If their job title is assistant professor or lecturer, yeah, assistant professor or lecturer, it means they're significantly less likely to have money because they're not tenured. It may be tenure track, but they're not tenured. And if their title is professor and they're over like a center, like say they're the professor of law and the director of the, I don't know, the housing assistance center at the law school, it means not only do they have their own personal money, so like they have their salary, and tenured professors have a lot of what's called discretionary money. So the university will give them, say, $100,000, literally like $100,000 that they can use for whatever they want at the university. It could be for research, it could be for research assistants, and a number of other things. So if they're a professor and they're over a center, it means they have money for that center or institute or whatever it is, and they have additional money. And those are the people who you would want to seek out in terms of assistantships. The thing with these, unlike um, financial aid jobs like work study, is that these are just literally jobs and they hire people who are most qualified for it. So say if you're getting your master's degree in, I don't know, say you're getting your master's degree in education or your PhD in education, but you've worked as like a financial analyst or something, and your undergraduate degrees in finance, and there's a center at your university called the, I don't know, Financial Literacy Center, in the business school. If you apply there and they determine you to be the best person for the job, they will hire you over someone who's in that college. And that happens fairly often because they're simply jobs. And they pay as jobs. Well, they pay better than jobs because they pay tuition as well. But they're jobs. And so what I always tell people is don't be hesitant to apply to departments that you're not even necessarily in. Of both of the places where I had an assistantship, where it paid tuition and X amount of dollars, between 18 and $40 an hour, neither of which were actually in the department in which I was going to school. They were in some other department. I was in the public policy school, one was in the College of Liberal Arts, and the other was in the School for International Affairs. But I had experience in both of those fields. They were kind of similar to my field, but I experienced in those fields, and one of which I just reached out to. I sent my resume, I sent like a cover letter, and the coordinator told me, it's like, we don't have any job openings. And I said, like, I know you don't have job openings, but I believe that if you were to consider my application, look at my research, look at the things that I've done, I think that I'd be a great fit, and these are the things I would like to do. Or not the things that so much I would like to do, but the things that I would be able to contribute. And it's really important for these assistantships, um, is that you're able to articulate very well and very easily what you're able to do, what you're able to contribute to make their job easier. Because these assistantships, um, while they're technically student jobs, these are graduate level jobs. Like, you're grown adults. You're not, odds are you're not, 18, 17, 18, 19, coming out of high school. They don't want to have to supervise you very closely, especially if you're doing research. And both of my positions which were research assistantships as opposed to teaching assistantships, they'll have an expectation that you contribute to the research activity of that institute, of that center. And so you are essentially doing proactive, engaging, and personalized research that's relevant to what that center is doing. And that means that they're not watching over your shoulder. They're not making sure that you do X, Y, and Z. They're going to review your research. They're going to, assist you. They're going to tell you X, Y, and Z. But it's not kind of a typical. It's not a menial job. You're not pressing buttons and turning levers. And so you need to be able to articulate that you're able to contribute in a meaningful way, which means you're going to have to understand exactly what that institute does. So you can reach out to people that work there, people that used to work there. You have to do research in order to get a research job. The teaching assistant jobs are a little bit different. They're a little bit more biased to people who are in that particular department. If there's a teaching assistant job for language, is really easy. For teaching assistant job for language, like Spanish or French, odds are they're going to give those teaching assistant jobs to people in the French or Spanish department or anthropology. That being said, it's still not impossible to get teaching assistant jobs. It's just they usually have a certain number that are reserved for those in those departments. But kind of going back to that, financial analyst example, if you if you were a financial analyst and the finance department has teaching assistants to teach finance, even if you're in a master's or PhD level program in something else, you probably have a good shot at getting that position. But at the same time, with those, just like the research assistantships, the teaching assistantships don't necessarily exist. You just have to find a professor that's willing to hire you. A lot of professors don't necessarily have teaching assistantships. They may have had bad experiences, any number of things, but if they have money and you're able to convince them that you would be a good fit, that you would be able to teach the course, that you'd be able to assist them and do whatever you need to, then there's a good chance that they'll hire you if you were to actually engage them. And yeah, so I think I went a little bit over, mostly because I muted myself at some point. So that's pretty much everything I have for the presentation. And I'm going to unmute you all now in case y'all have any questions. Hopefully not.
I have a question, Jonathan.
Yes.
Okay, you said that one key to securing funding is to participate early in research and in undergrad. What happened if you don't necessarily have that type of experience?
It doesn't necessarily have to be in undergrad. What it is essentially is, and you're referring to fellowships, not assistantships, correct?
Yes, just fellowships.
Right. So I think I was talking about assistantships when I said that. I'm pretty sure. If I'm wrong, correct me. But for fellowships, you don't necessarily have to have research activity. Oh, you know what? I know what it is. For my specific fellowship, the one that I did, it was a research-based fellowship. Not all fellowships are research-based. So mine was actually, it's a national program that you start in undergrad as a sophomore or junior. And then if you do well and everything, and you compile research, you apply for it at the graduate level. So for my specific fellowship, I needed to have research experience because that was the whole basis of it. But that's not how all fellowships operate. A lot of the fellowships are just based on sometimes just your application. Like, say, well, what program are you in, or are you going to be in?
Probably either languages or education.
Right. So yeah, for either one of those, you're not going to be expected to have research experience for the most part, not at the institutional level anyway.
Okay.
So for those, like, let's say, and I'm just making up a university, I know you're not necessarily applying here. Like say University of Ohio, you're applying for to their um, you said languages or education, right?
Yes.
You're applying to, you know, their school of education. Their education fellowship that they have is probably going to be based more on your contribution to the field of education, as opposed to having any particular, you know, research background or what you will contribute. Um, Usually those fellowships are very broad. Um, Mine was specific, but it's a really, really minute example. Usually those are very broad, and it's a matter of honestly convincing the chair, whoever's responsible for the decision making, that you're the best person for it, which has to do with engaging with them early and often.
Okay.
Hi, Jonathan. I have a couple questions, please.
Okay.
My name is Maj. The first one is, I know you talked about research assistantships. So how do we find research assistantships and what type of experience is required, if any? And my second question is, how do we find research-based fellowships for people without the PhDs? Because I'm researching online a lot,
Mhm.
and most of the fellowships that require a PhD or an MD. So how can we go about that with a master's degree? And I'm in a PhD program, but they don't provide funding. So I'm paying out of pocket or getting a loan.
Okay. So the finding assistantships is really, it's a very, very informal process. The vast, vast majority of institutions, or not just institutions, of departments, don't even advertise their assistantships. They just hire whoever they think did well in the class, if it's for teaching assistantships. For research assistantships, it's all word of mouth. So typically your best opportunity is to reach out to the centers and institutes at the university that you want to work, whether they have applications open or not. For the two places that I was a research assistant, neither of them ever, as far as I know, published an application. And both of them, I just reached out to them without even knowing anyone that worked there. I just sent over my materials. I sent a resume, a cover letter. I sent over some research and stuff that I'd done. And I said, you know, I know you don't have necessarily an open application. I don't even know if you have graduate students that work there, but I think for X, Y, and Z reasons that I would be a great person. Well, the only thing that I did know, well, I knew what they did, but I also knew that their center had a lot of money because one of them had just gotten a grant for like $4 million or something. And the other one, the professor was tenured. So I knew at bare minimum, if they didn't hire me, it's because they didn't want to hire me, not because they couldn't. So it's when they have money, it's their choice whether to hire you or not. There's not a rule saying whether they can or can't. With tenured professors, the whole nature of tenure is they have freedom. And if they have freedom and they have money, it's their choice. And can you remind me the second part of your question? Oh, was about
The
funding?
second is how to find fellowships that provide funding for master's level degree.
For master's levels degree. So those are few and far between. So mine were both, mine, was there two? Yeah, mine were both for master's level. It was based on having previous experience. Typically for master's level, aside from the specific one that I'm referring to, you likely, if it's for research-based fellowships, you likely have to look at external fellowships. So for example, the NSF, the National Science Foundation, has a graduate fellowship. I don't remember what it's called, but it's they have a graduate fellowship that's for both master's and PhD level. It doesn't matter your degree. You have to be a graduate student, but it doesn't matter your degree. And it depends on what your degree is, which one you apply for, because there's one for social sciences, there's one for hard sciences, but it's based on you have to submit a research proposal, but you don't have to have had research background previous to that. So they have a number of topics that they change every year, and you have to submit a research proposal within one of those fields. So one year they might, like, let's say for sociology, it might be on child literacy and improving X, Y, and Z. And so, you have to find something that's within your scope. I think they're able to figure out pretty quickly, and it would kind of potentially be a waste of your time to just do something for the sake of the funding. but there's usually a good number of options that you have. So that's the one, that's the external fellowships. That's the one I'm most familiar with, which is the National Science Foundation one.
Can I respond to your comment, actually? I
Okay.
have a research proposal, but I couldn't find funding for it. So, and I won't be the PI because of the credentialing. So how can I approach that? I did check the NSF website and they do have something like that. But then they said that I have to be a PI, and they, you know, I couldn't find like per se the eligibility period, or I mean, the eligibility criteria. So how do I go about honing in or finding more information in that regard?
One thing that you just reminded me about that I should probably do a presentation on at some point is a really, really good way to get funding. When you, well, first of all, principal investigator, the PI that you're talking about, when they're talking about principal, when NSF is talking about principal investigator, it doesn't mean that you're the, it's not talking about like your advisor, it's talking about you. So you know, if you're in a PhD or graduate program, you would be the principal investigator. So that would be you. But another really good way to get funding is actually joining a professor's research team or research group that already exists. So finding, you know, a professor in your department, or they could be out of your department if it's relevant enough to your field, and you can join theirs, and you can actually apply to fellowships on that basis. It wouldn't be NSF. NSF, you have to be the principal investigator, but there are different fellowships, like the National Institute of Health. There's a few that you can apply for that you don't have to be the principal investigator. There's institutional level ones. Like I remember at UT, there was a few that you could apply for even if you weren't the primary and, you know, the principal investigator. So that's kind of another alternative way, is if you're on a research team, as long as you're contributing in a significant fashion, even if you're not the principal person, you can still apply for funding.
And does it usually cover the fellowship, the research part of it, or is that on my personal expenses, or how does that work? Because, you know, when I take the money, is it gonna be only for the proposal, or can I spend it on my stuff and my living expenses?
Varies. What does this go away? That varies pretty drastically.
Okay.
Sorry, I had like a notification that came up. That varies really drastically depending on what it is. Like that's, you know, one of the issues with the institutional fellowships is all institutions are independent. And so I can tell you a lot about what happens with the University of Texas, but I can only speak broadly about any other university. I just know for American universities in general, and I speak of large, mostly large universities, and I say large universities because they have the most money, obviously. Their institutional, their high level institutional fellowships will pay for, you know, I mean, they'll pay for tuition and they'll pay for a stipend. For strictly research-based fellowships, the vast majority of the time, mine is kind of an anomaly. The vast majority of the time, they just give you X amount of dollars. They don't know what your tuition is. Because it's usually, while the university gives you the money, it's usually coming from an outside source. So the university gives you the money, but like the money might have actually come from the Ford Foundation or from like the state of California or for any number of things. So for a lot of those, it'll be like you're awarded $30,000, and you have to do the research, you know, that you're proposing. Whether you use all $30,000 on the research is up to you. You know, they'll have criteria for things that you have to meet. Like you have to do X, Y, and Z for whatever the research is. You'll have to do all the things that you proposed. And if there's money left over, you can use that on, you know, what's considered qualified school expenses, which includes housing, living, food, you know, all those different kinds of things. But so I can only kind of speak on that really, you know, broadly, because every university does things a little bit differently.
Thank you.
In response, someone wrote about tips for nationally competitive fellowships. Nationally, that's kind of a difficult question. So nationally competitive fellowships. So there's two kinds of well, I'll say there's two kinds of nationally competitive fellowships. One, you have, you know, like I said, there's the external and the institutional. For the external ones, I'd say what's really, really important for the external ones, so National Institute of Health, National Science Foundation, Bill and Melinda Gates, anything else, is finding people who won that fellowship. One thing that I know which I didn't get I didn't even apply for it, the National Science Foundation fellowship, is that universities, or at least I know for the University of Texas and University of California system, people who have won it, the university actually pays them to help other people, because the university has an interest in having their students earn fellowships as opposed to other students. So a friend of mine who won it at Berkeley, the university pays him like, I don't know, $200 or something to help people with that, to help people apply for it. And so him winning it, obviously he knows how to win it. So you want to find people who have won it, and and sometimes, like sometimes maybe it's a reality check, because I know he's told me for a couple people after meeting with them that they didn't necessarily meet like the expectations for it. Not even something all the time. It's not always like, grades and what they've necessarily done, but sometimes people is like, well, I don't have enough time to write a 30-page research proposal. And it's like, well, if you don't have time to write a 30-page research proposal, then just don't apply. Just don't waste your time. So for those nationally competitive one, I think the most important first thing you can do, considering for those national ones, there's a lot of people that won it, is find people who have in fact won it, and try to go from there. The institutional ones, like I kind of mentioned, is reach out early and often and snowball. And when I say snowball, it's a research term too. Find someone who knows someone who knows someone about the kind of fellowship that you're looking for. And often, because there's so many different kinds of fellowships, but there's so few of each individual fellowship, there's also very few people that know about them. And so you have to find a way to find what those fellowships are, because they're not always posted. If they are posted, sometimes they're really hard to find. And even the people that you would think that should probably know about them, like your department chair, don't necessarily. And so I'll say, let's say you're trying to enroll for September or August, depends on what country. If you're trying to enroll for September or August of next year, to have the best chance to get a fellowship, you would need to be, what is it, September? I don't even know what month it is. You would need to be reaching out to people now, like literally now, while obviously doing your GRE or whatever test and stuff that you need to do. But you need to be engaging with people like literally at this very instance. Does anyone else have any questions?
Can I have one more question? If
Sure.
no one else is. How do you go about funding a graduate school if it's not part of the funding institution? I was looking at some funding agencies, and they said if your institution is not affiliated, then you have to petition for it. So how do you go about doing that?
Okay, I haven't done that personally, but I know some people that have. Really what it comes down to is, for some, typically those are like regional kinds of fellowships, because national fellowships, they work with basically any university. So like any of those ones I mentioned, the national anything, the National Institute of Health, National Science Foundation, all those. They don't necessarily have partnerships with any particular university. It's just, you just have to be a part of a university. For other ones, I'm trying to remember, there was one I remember that had something like that. It was in Mississippi. But for those, what you need to do is you need to find the people in your department who have clouts, which for the most part is going to be your chair. You need to find your chair. You need to tell them about whatever the fellowship is. You need to talk to whoever is responsible on the other end. Like, let's say, I'm just going to make something up, Mississippi Institute of Health. It doesn't really matter. Like, let's say, and you're going to a school in Mississippi that's for some reason not associated. You need to reach out to them, ask them what needs to be done, who needs to contact them, if there needs to be legal documents, memorandum of understanding. Usually it's called a MOU, a memorandum of understanding, that needs to be signed between the university and whatever that institution is. And try to make it easy, try to make it easy for both sides. So instead of, for example, saying, you call this person, you do this, X, Y, and Z, make it as easy as possible. They may ask you to do particular things. If there isn't a relationship, it is going to be a little bit of work. So you have to kind of think ahead of time, whether it's worth your time, and two, whether you have a good chance of actually winning the award. In some cases, you can apply even if there isn't a relationship, but you can't be awarded if there's a if there isn't a relationship. So in that case, um, I would just do that. You know, apply for it, do whatever you need to do, and then if you win it, then go through all that, as opposed to going through all that and then you don't even win it anyway. So that's kind of, you know, what I would suggest there.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
I have one.
Okay.
Okay. My second question is, how would you go about reaching out to potential advisors?
Reaching out to potential advisors. Um, so it's twofold. There's two things. There's one thing that I didn't know that I wish I knew when I was reaching out for advisors. One, you need to do everything I say is going to start with do research, but you need to do research on what their research is. If you're just starting, I don't know if you're just starting, or if you're, well, I imagine you're probably just starting, or you're applying if you're asking that question. You need to look through everyone's research. Lisa, give me one second. Okay. You need to look through everyone's research and determine what is closest to your interest. You're never going to find someone. Hopefully, actually, you shouldn't find someone that does exactly what you do, because hopefully your research is so awesome and unique. Your interest is so awesome and unique that it doesn't exactly apply to any particular thing. But you want to find someone who's very, very close, even if that's not in your department, because you can. One, you can have multiple advisors. There's no rule against having multiple advisors. You just have to have a minimum of one, obviously. The other thing, and this is the thing that I knew about, but I wasn't as intentional about. You need to make sure that their ideology is consistent with yours, because let's say that your research is on gentrification. That's what my research is on. Let's say your research is on gentrification, and you find someone that does, you know, who's really well known that does gentrification, except all their research is about how gentrification doesn't exist or how gentrification isn't a problem, which I don't agree with. But you might find someone who does maybe even the exact kind of research that you do, or that is very, very similar to what you do, but they might disagree wholeheartedly with the nature of what your research is. So you have to make sure those two things, that their research itself is very similar to yours, and that their ideology is similar to yours. Because if you find people, like I did, my first advisor, that where their ideology is inconsistent with yours, you're going to have a very, very bad time, because they're going to tell you that every single thing you're doing is wrong because they don't agree with the very nature of your research.
Okay, thank you.
Does that make sense?
Yes, yes, it does.
Yeah. And the last thing I'll say on that is, and just in terms of reaching out to them, I mean, all you have to do is send them an email. If they don't respond to your email, do what I do and just show up to their office at some point. Um, there, I guess one other thing with that is make sure they don't have 1,000 advisees. Sometimes the unfortunate thing is that the best professors have 100,000 advisees and they just don't have time for you. You want to make sure that they actually legitimately have time for you, or you'll just never see them. Unless you want to make them kind of a secondary advisor, you know, if you find someone who's like really, really awesome and famous and whatever, and they do all wonderful things, it's unfortunate, but you might not want to have them as your first advisor. You might not want to have them as the person that you can depend on week in, week out, because like one of my advisors, fortunately, he wasn't my primary one. He was like really well known. He's always going on book tours and going out of the country, which sounds awesome unless they're your advisor and they're always out of the country. They're always in like New York or something. And really it's just kind of, you know, I think that's just having a conversation with them. It's like, you know, how available are you actually? How often can we actually meet? How often can we actually talk about things? That same guy, I'm not gonna say his name. I mean, he's awesome. I knew him and we were on good terms, and I think it would take 2 to 3 weeks for him to respond to emails. I can only imagine how long it took for him to respond to people that he didn't know. So that's another thing. You know, you want to make sure that they actually legitimately have time for you.
Okay.
Any other questions?
If no one else has any questions, can I have some more questions?
Why not?
Okay, so my question is a follow-up of actually Deidre's question, which is if I know an advisor that is well connected in the university, but his interest area is not really aligned with mine, but I know he has connections. What is the best way to approach them? Or, you know,
It's really
ask them
simple.
for a
Just,
favor, let's put it this way.
yeah, I would say it's really simple. I would just reach out to them, tell them that you're interested in their research and everything. One thing about academics is that if they're anything, well, a lot are, and I'll speak especially for me, but academics in general is we're often very convinced that no one cares about our research as much as we do, and that it's not as awesome as we think it is. And so a really easy way in that I found in meeting with academics, which I do, I'm not dishonest about it, is, you know, I looked over your research about X, Y, and Z that you did in whatever, wherever, and I think it's great. I'd like to talk a little bit more about it and see if it aligns with my research. You go, you talk. Maybe you find out that the research is even closer than you thought it was. Worst case scenario, you know, you ask them if they know anyone whose research aligns more with yours. I haven't run, I don't think I have. I haven't, maybe one, but I don't remember. I haven't run into any professors that I was able to meet with that were like, no, I'm not going to help you. I've yet to have that issue, fortunately.
That's good. I had a lot of unresponsive professors.
Yeah, I mean, that is a thing though. I mean, there's plenty of professors that haven't responded to me. I don't take it personally. I usually, when I ask other people, it's like they don't respond to anyone. Or, you know, depending on, you know, who they are and everything. Like I mentioned, that professor that's always going on book tours and is out of the country and stuff like that. It's like, that's just kind of how he treats everyone he doesn't know. I don't think it's intentional, but it's like, I'll refer it, I don't know, I'll refer it to like LeBron James. It's like LeBron James is not going to respond to like any random person that sends him an email. And some professors are like that. And, you know, in the academic world, they just don't necessarily have the time. It kind of depends on how much time and effort you want to spend to get in touch with this very specific person. You know, if their research is that much in line with yours, if you think that they could be able to contribute that much, you know, to your academic life, fellowships, assistantships, whatever, that kind of stuff. I don't know if it's best, but what I did, which was unintentional because I didn't, and I don't care if they're like famous or anything, or if they're like really well known. I just want their research to be in line and for them to be generally good academics. The same way that I mentioned the people who have the most money, who have the most clout are professors, followed by assistant professors, followed by lecturers, obviously, is also the same rule, but inverted in terms of who has the most time. Professors have the least time, followed by assistant professors, followed by lecturers.
Thank you.
Lisa, I know you're writing about tips for nationally competitive fellowships, but I just answered that like 10 minutes ago. Probably take maybe if there's two other unique questions, if any. And since I don't know who's muted or not, if you are talking, send a message because I don't hear anyone.
How often do you do these sessions, Jonathan, and how available are you to do them privately or talk to people and give them more advice and so on and so forth? If you don't mind.
This is just the second one that I've done. I did one back in, who knows what month it is? It's September. I think I did one back in May, but I just started being more active with ProFellow like last month. Vicky, the founder and CEO or president, CEO, she just started like a new ProFellow expert program. So I'll be doing more of these. I don't know what they'll be yet. I'll put like surveys and stuff up, which is like what I did for this. I put up survey to see what people are most interested in hearing, and I won't be overlapping very much, except maybe in the question period. So the next one maybe will be on research. I don't know. In terms of privately, so I don't know about video conferences necessarily. I mean, anyone can message me general questions about things. In terms of, so like basically any of the questions that were asked today, I don't think any of the questions were inappropriate. Any of the questions that were asked today, I'd be willing to answer. You know, if you just send me a private message, if you send me like a private message on the network, on the Mighty Network ProFellow thing. For anything that's like really, really specific, like sometimes people ask me like to review research or to review applications, or just anything that's extremely specific that requires me to do what I call work. This I don't really consider. I don't know, some people do, but I don't really consider this work. I'm just talking. Anything that requires me to do work, then I do ask to make arrangements for actual, like, you know, a fee. But anything like today, you know, general questions about stuff, generally how to like find things, how and who to talk to people, stuff like that. All you have to do is send me a message.
Sure, sounds good. Thank you. That was very helpful.
Rum. One more question, if any. I feel really bad about muting myself earlier. Hopefully y'all didn't miss too much.
Do we have time for one more question if no one else has it?
Let me just ask real quick. Oh, someone did ask a question and I didn't see it. I mean, kind of. Well, you know what? It might have been during the time where I was muted. Jasmine asked about awards being stackable, and the answer is it depends. Some institutions have rules against stacking. I know that the University of California system does have a rule against stacking, but I also know that the University of Ohio and the University of Texas system doesn't. Because at UT, there was two, well, let me think. I got a university level fellowship at McNair, and then a department level fellowship. I don't remember what it was called, but a department level fellowship. And I had an external one as well, an assistantship. And I remember what I don't know, it was kind of funny and maybe rude, but when I was like applying for all these fellowships and everything, because my rule is, unless you're going to tell me that I explicitly can't do something, I'm going to do it. They had told me this, like, it's not recommended that you do an assistantship job and you have a fellowship and stuff like that. And I asked, are you telling me that I can't or that I shouldn't? And they said I shouldn't, so I applied for it. You have to ask about those rules, or just find out what those rules are. It really depends on the institutions. What I will say is outside fellowships, so long as they're from different institutions, like say, I keep using the same ones because those are the ones I'm most familiar with. National Institute of Health, National Science Foundation. While those both are the federal government, they are two different institutions in the federal government. So say if you somehow got both, they would just add on top of each other. But say if you're in the University of California system, for example, and you got, I don't know, two of their institution level fellowships, they will only give you one and the other one will disappear and go to somebody else probably, which means you just shouldn't do that. So it really depends on the institution. But outside fellowships are almost universally stackable for the most part. They may have rules themselves, but as far as I know, as long as they're different external institutions, that they're usually stackable. And to who would I ask? It depends. For the institutional level ones, probably financial aid. I think for the institutional level ones, you would ask whoever is responsible for that money, which isn't always financial aid. Financial aid, actually, it would very rarely be financial aid. Financial aid is responsible for scholarships, federal funding, state funding, stuff like that. Fellowships are offered by the university itself, so which would effectively be like the president's office or the chancellor, depending on whatever university you go to. So you would just need to talk to the department that is responsible for the fellowship, which can vary drastically. It could be financial aid, but odds are it's probably not. So whenever you see the fellowship could be from the department. So you ask the department, could be from the president's office. You ask the president's office. It could be from the National Science Foundation, National Science Foundation. Depends on who it comes from. Unfortunately, I don't have any time for any more questions, but if you do have more questions, just send me a message. I'll probably respond tomorrow. Yeah, I'll probably respond tomorrow. Just send me a personal message through Mighty Networks, ProFellow, etc. And as long as they fit my rule, which is not work, and they're general questions, I will answer them. All right. Thank you all for your time, and have a good night or morning, depending on wherever you are. Bye.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Have a good day.
Have
We
a good
appreciate
night.
it. That was very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Oh, have a good night. Thank you.
Good night.